At 14:30 local time, the quiet of the Dnipro River delta broke without warning. In this stretch of southern Ukraine, the river no longer looks like a river. It splinters into narrow channels, soft mud, and tall reeds that swallow sound and hide movement. There are no clear front lines here, only blind corners, weak signals, and mistakes that last seconds. A Ukrainian FPV drone team had just launched on what appeared to be a routine mission. Intelligence suggested small Russian boats would move through the channels before sunset, carrying supplies to forward observation posts. Then, minutes into the flight, something changed. The threat did not come from the water. It came from the sky. What followed was no longer a plan. It became a test of reaction, coordination, and survival measured in moments, not minutes. To understand why this moment mattered, it helps to first understand why these boats, and this stretch of river, had become a battlefield in the first place. The decision to use FPV drones in this area was not about technology, but about geography and habit, because the lower Dnipro forces Russian units to move in very specific ways. Here, the river breaks into narrow channels where large boats cannot operate, and armored vehicles become useless once the waterline disappears into mud and reeds. To keep observation posts supplied, Russian forces rely on small high-speed boats, often rigid inflatable types because they can slip through tight waterways, change direction quickly, and stay below the threshold that usually triggers heavy artillery fire. These boats are not designed to fight, but to move fast, unload supplies, and vanish before dusk, which makes them ideal for a river system that punishes anything slow or predictable. On their own, the observation posts these boats support do not look important. Each one might only hold a few soldiers with radios, optics, and a drone launcher, but together they form a chain that watches kilometers of shoreline day and night. That chain feeds targeting data to mortars, artillery, and reconnaissance drones, allowing Russian fire units to respond within minutes when Ukrainian movement is detected. For Ukraine, breaking this system does not require capturing ground or winning a major battle. It only requires interrupting the flow of supplies often enough that those posts lose power, lose batteries, or lose confidence, and eventually have to pull back. This is why the focus is on logistics, not front lines, and why small boats matter more than armored columns in this part of the war. FPV drones fit this problem almost perfectly. They are inexpensive compared to missiles, can be launched in large numbers, and are deadly in close spaces where radar, air defense, and electronic warfare struggle to react in time. In narrow channels, a boat has very little room to maneuver, and even a small drone can approach from angles that leave the crew only seconds to respond. This choice also reflects a broader Ukrainian approach that has developed over time. Rather than pushing directly against fortified positions, Ukrainian units often aim to weaken the systems that support those positions, forcing the opponent to spend more resources just to maintain the same level of control. In this sense, FPV teams act less like strike units and more like hunters targeting the supply lines that keep the battlefield running. The Ukrainian operators involved in this mission were working from patterns observed over many weeks. Russian boats tended to move before sunset, when light was fading but visibility was still good enough for navigation, and they often reused the same channels to save time and fuel. In river terrain like this, geography creates natural bottlenecks where routes narrow, turns sharpen, and speed drops, which makes ambush not only possible, but likely. The plan was simple in concept. Launch early, position drones ahead of the expected route, and wait near those choke points where boats would have no space to dodge or accelerate away. At close range, even a short delay in reaction could be enough to decide the outcome. This is why the operation mattered even before a single boat was spotted. It was designed to test whether small, cheap systems could still shape control over a large stretch of terrain, and whether pressure applied in the right place could force changes without a direct clash. This was not meant to be a decisive engagement. It was one moment in a long campaign of attrition, where success is measured not by territory gained, but by how often the other side is forced to adapt, reroute, or slow down. But as the drones moved toward their waiting positions, the team learned a hard lesson that defines modern warfare, because in this environment, the hunters are almost never alone. The first real turning point came when the Ukrainian FPV team realized they were no longer hunting alone, because a Russian Lancet drone had already found them. This was not chance or bad luck, but the result of weeks of pressure where Russian forces had learned to search for the people behind the drones, not just the machines flying toward their units. Russian counter-drone teams focus on patterns rather than single signals. FPV control points tend to follow familiar behaviors such as short setup times, repeated antenna angles, and predictable movement after launch, and those habits create a footprint that can be tracked from the air. Once a control node is confirmed, a strike drone does not need much time to act, because the distance from detection to impact can be measured in minutes. As the Ukrainian FPVs continued toward their planned intercept area, the warning came suddenly. A spotter noticed a small dark shape dropping fast through the clouds, and within seconds that shape resolved into a sharp triangle cutting straight toward the launch site. There was no radio call, no countdown, and no time to debate what to do next. The operators reacted on instinct. One tore the main antenna cable free while grabbing the backup connector. Another abandoned the control position entirely, and both sprinted toward a shallow dugout reinforced with timber and packed earth. Their movements were fast but not chaotic, shaped by drills practiced many times with the clear understanding that hesitation would be fatal. The Lancet struck moments later. Its warhead, estimated at around 3 kilograms and designed to punch through armored targets, detonated where the operators had been sitting seconds before. Earth and wood exploded upward, throwing dirt high into the air and leaving a crater that marked exactly how narrow the escape had been. What mattered most was not the blast itself, but the timing. Had the drone arrived slightly earlier, or had the team paused even briefly, the outcome would have been very different. In this kind of warfare, survival is often decided by small actions taken under extreme pressure rather than by armor or firepower. While the strike destroyed the primary control point, it failed to stop the mission entirely. The FPVs were already in the air, moving along their route, and the Ukrainian team had planned for the possibility of being hit. Backup connections and alternate control paths existed for this reason, allowing the drones to continue even as the ground situation collapsed. This moment highlights a core reality of modern drone combat. The operator is just as exposed as the machine, and sometimes more so, because a drone can be replaced while a trained crew cannot. Both sides understand this, which is why control points have become high-value targets equal to artillery positions or command vehicles. The Lancet strike also sent a clear message. Russia was not simply reacting to drone attacks, but actively hunting the systems that enabled them, using strike drones to punish any team that stayed in one place too long. This forces Ukrainian operators into constant movement, increasing fatigue and risk even before they ever see a target. Yet the failure of the strike to end the mission shows the limits of this approach. Destroying a single node does not collapse a network built to absorb losses, and removing one team from the field does not stop the pressure if others can take over. This balance between attack and adaptation defines much of the fighting in this sector. In the space of a few seconds, the Ukrainian team went from confident hunters to exposed targets, and then back to operators racing against time. The mission continued, but the conditions had changed, and the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. With their primary position destroyed and the drones still moving forward, the next challenge was not firepower, but whether control could be restored fast enough to keep the mission alive. The strike destroyed the primary control point, but the Ukrainian FPV drones stayed in the air because this mission was built on the assumption that a hit was not a possibility, but an expectation. Years into the war, Ukrainian drone teams no longer plan around perfect conditions. They plan around disruption, loss, and recovery under pressure. The reason the drones did not drop from the sky lies in a distributed relay system designed to survive sudden breaks. Instead of relying on one strong control link, Ukraine spreads multiple radio nodes across several kilometers, often 4 to 5, each watching the others and checking connection health many times per second. When one node goes dark, routing shifts automatically, and another node takes control in a fraction of a second, fast enough that the drone does not register the change. This approach did not appear overnight. It reflects hard lessons learned from hundreds of previous FPV losses, where a single strike or jammer could end a mission instantly. Over time, Ukrainian operators adapted by treating every control point as temporary and every signal path as fragile, building systems that assume failure and continue anyway. In practical terms, this meant the FPVs kept moving toward their targets even as the ground teams scrambled to recover. Telemetry remained steady, video feeds stayed usable, and battery data continued to update, giving operators a narrow window to reassert control before range became a problem. For a moment, the technology did exactly what it was designed to do. However, resilience comes with trade-offs. As the team pulled back into trenches and deeper cover, the physical distance between controllers and drones began to stretch beyond safe limits. Every meter of retreat reduced signal strength, and once that gap reached several kilometers, degradation would begin whether the network was stable or not. To compensate, a second team had to move forward. They carried spare antennas, batteries, and basic spectrum tools, advancing toward the river through shallow trenches carved into soft delta soil. This movement was not aggressive or bold, but necessary, because staying hidden would mean losing control altogether. This decision pushed the operators into a zone where Russian retaliation was most likely. After a confirmed strike on a control point, follow-up attacks often come quickly, sometimes within minutes, using mortars, snipers, or another strike drone. The closer the team moved to open ground near the water, the higher the risk became. Here, the contrast between machines and people becomes clear. The FPVs could fly through danger without fear, switching links and adjusting routes as needed. The operators had no such buffer, and every relocation exposed them to observation, sound, and thermal detection. This balance defines much of modern drone warfare. Technology can absorb shocks, reroute data, and keep systems running, but it cannot remove the need for human presence. Someone still has to carry equipment, choose positions, and accept the risk that comes with being close enough to stay connected. In this moment, the mission survived because the system held, not because the situation became safer. The drones remained active, but the margin for error narrowed as the team traded concealment for control. Each step forward bought signal strength at the cost of exposure. This is the quiet pressure that rarely appears in short clips or headlines. Behind every drone strike is a series of small movements, fast decisions, and calculated risks made under the knowledge that another attack could already be inbound. As the team settled into a new position near the river, the next threat did not arrive from the air, but from across the water, where an unseen shooter was already lining up a shot. The next danger arrived quietly, and it showed how fast old methods still matter in a war filled with new machines. As the Ukrainian team settled into their new position near the riverbank, a single rifle shot cracked across the water, sharp and flat, cutting through the noise of insects and distant engines. The shooter was positioned on the far side of the river, roughly 600 meters away, with open water between him and the target. There was no wind to drift the bullet, no uneven ground to hide movement, and no clutter to block the line of sight, which made the conditions close to perfect for a trained sniper. The first round missed, but it was close enough to warn the team that someone had already found them. The Ukrainian response did not come from a rifle. Instead of returning fire with small arms, they shifted immediately to artillery, a choice that reflects a very American way of thinking about battlefield advantage. When precision and speed matter, and when friendly lives are at risk, the fastest solution is often the biggest one that can be controlled. Calling for artillery under these conditions is not casual or reckless. The request was classified as danger close, meaning the friendly team was within range where even small errors could be fatal. That label triggers a stricter process, slower in theory, but designed to prevent mistakes that cannot be taken back. The observer began by fixing the shooter's position as accurately as possible. Using a laser rangefinder, he measured distance within a single meter, then combined that data with elevation, direction, and a map reference carried on his arm. This produced a grid precise enough to guide fire without guesswork, even under pressure. Adjustments were communicated using mills, a system familiar to anyone trained in artillery or heavy weapons. Instead of thinking in degrees, crews work in a circle divided into thousands of equal parts, where one mill roughly equals 1 meter of shift at 1 kilometer. It is simple math designed for speed, allowing corrections to be called and applied quickly while rounds are already in flight. Before the guns fired, multiple officers independently checked the data. They confirmed friendly positions, verified angles, and reviewed firing tables to account for barrel wear and propellant temperature, both of which can change where a shell lands. These steps exist because danger-close missions leave no margin for error, and the cost of a mistake is measured in lives. When the first shell landed, it struck short of the target, throwing dirt and debris into the air. The observer watched closely, then called a correction, shifting the aim just enough to close the gap without overshooting. Within seconds, additional rounds followed, each one refining the solution. During this time, the sniper fired again. The bullet passed close enough to be felt, its pressure wave snapping through the air near the observer's arm. Still, the correction went out, and the guns adjusted once more. The next impacts landed exactly where needed. The sniper's position disappeared in a column of earth and shattered vegetation, and the far bank fell silent almost immediately. No shots followed, and no movement could be seen through optics or thermal sensors. There was no celebration. The team did not shout, cheer, or pause to reflect on what had just happened. They treated the silence as a brief opening, not a sign of safety, because experience had taught them that stillness often precedes the next threat. This exchange captured something essential about the conflict. It showed how modern systems like drones and digital networks still depend on traditional firepower to resolve moments of extreme risk. More importantly, it revealed how quickly different layers of warfare can connect, turning observation into action within minutes. The sniper had been part of the old war, relying on skill, patience, and terrain. The response came from the new war, where sensors, data, and heavy weapons merge into a single decision cycle. Neither side acted alone, and neither relied on one tool. For the Ukrainian team, the goal was not to prove superiority. It was simply to remove an immediate threat and continue the mission before conditions changed again. With the riverbank quiet for the moment and control restored, attention returned to the air, where a far more complex fight was already unfolding above the channels. The most intense phase began when Ukrainian FPV feeds finally picked up movement in the channels, because 4 Russian boats were pushing through a narrow cut toward the expected bottleneck. They were close, tightly spaced, and committed to the route, which is exactly what the ambush had been waiting for. At the same time, a different fight was already unfolding above the water. Russian FPV drones started to appear on the screens, not one at a time but in groups, spreading out to cover different angles and escape paths. These drones were not advanced or precise, but they did not need to be, because their strength came from numbers rather than skill. This is where modern drone combat becomes unforgiving. Every FPV drone that relies on radio control must transmit a signal back to its operator, and that signal spreads in all directions like a light bulb rather than a narrow beam. Even cheap spectrum analyzers can pick up those emissions from several kilometers away, which means detection is often mutual and unavoidable. In this environment, no drone is truly hidden. Ukrainian operators could see Russian signals growing stronger, and Russian teams could track Ukrainian transmissions doing the same, turning the sky into a shared map of moving targets. The result was not a clean duel, but a crowded space where everyone knew someone else was nearby. Russian forces have adapted to this reality with a simple idea. Instead of trying to protect boats with expensive jammers or traditional air defense, which struggle against small and slow targets, they launch waves of cheap FPVs designed to collide with enemy drones. The math favors this approach, because losing several low-cost drones is acceptable if it removes even one attacker. Ramming attacks are brutally difficult to execute. Two drones can close on each other at speeds near 100 kilometers per hour, while human reaction time alone can be a quarter of a second. Add video delay, and by the time an operator reacts, both machines have already moved several meters, turning every maneuver into a gamble. For the Ukrainian pilot, this meant constant evasive action. Sharp rolls, sudden drops, and aggressive climbs filled the screen as shadows flashed past the camera view. Each successful dodge kept the drone alive, but it also drained the battery faster and pulled attention away from the boats below. This is the hidden cost of drone defense. Every second spent avoiding collision is a second not spent tracking a target, lining up an approach, or confirming a strike point. As stress builds and alarms begin to sound, the pressure on the operator grows, because mistakes become more likely as energy and focus run low. Battery levels began to fall into the warning range. At that point, the team faced a clear choice, because there was no longer enough power to keep dodging attackers and still complete the mission. Pushing forward risked losing the drone before it could deliver useful information, while retreating would give the boats time to escape. The decision reflected doctrine rather than emotion. Instead of forcing an attack with limited power, the operator marked the boat's positions and transmitted precise coordinates to other teams, already preparing their own launches. This ensured the information would survive, even if the current drone did not. It was a deliberate sacrifice. The pilot kept the FPV in the air just long enough to maintain visual contact, even as enemy drones continued to close in. When the battery dropped further, the signal faded, and the drone eventually fell into the marsh, unrecoverable and spent. That loss did not end the engagement. New Ukrainian FPVs were already airborne, approaching from different directions, carrying fresh batteries and clear tasking. They did not need to search because the coordinates were waiting for them. As these drones arrived, the Russian boats reacted. Warned by their own operators that enemy drones were overhead, the crews split up, diving into separate channels to complicate targeting. In the tight waterways, however, speed and space were limited, and sharp turns became difficult to execute. The follow-on Ukrainian drones attacked from multiple angles, focusing on vulnerable points rather than chasing dramatic impacts. Strikes aimed at engines, sterns, and the seams between rigid floors and inflatable sides, where damage would quickly stop movement. Within moments, fires broke out and propulsion failed, turning fast boats into drifting obstacles. This sequence shows why the outcome was not about a single pilot or a single drone. The success came from a system that values information sharing, accepts losses, and keeps pressure constant rather than chasing perfect shots. Individual drones are expendable, but the process they serve is not. In this kind of battle, victory belongs to the side that can keep replacing assets, updating data, and forcing the opponent to react again and again. It is a contest of endurance and adaptation, where survival depends on how well systems work together under stress. When the last signals faded and the channels fell quiet, the immediate fight was over, but the consequences of what had just happened were only beginning to take shape along the river. The next wave arrived fast, and this time there was no room left for escape. Ukrainian FPVs struck where it mattered most, hitting hull sides, engines, and stern sections that keep small boats moving. 3 Russian boats burned or lost mobility within seconds, while a fourth slipped away, but without completing its supply run. That failure carried weight beyond the water. Without fresh batteries, fuel, and food, several Russian observation posts went dark, leaving a wide stretch of riverbank without eyes for days. In this kind of terrain, losing awareness means losing control, and that disadvantage compounds quickly. The Ukrainian teams did not stay to watch the results. They displaced again, knowing counterfire, mortars, or another Lancet would soon follow. Survival here depends on movement, not celebration. The lesson is not how many boats were destroyed. It is that modern war favors the side that adapts faster, replaces losses quicker, and keeps pressure constant. Tomorrow, Russia will adjust. Tomorrow, Ukraine will be waiting. If you want clear analysis like this and more real stories from today's battlefields, subscribe to Military Force and stay with us.